hit me like a tidal wave. 5 years of marriage, seemingly steady and full of shared dreams, torn apart in an instant. My husband, the man I thought I'd grow old with, filed for divorce out of the blue. No warning signs, no arguments leading up to it, just a sudden, cold set of papers handed to me. We had been together for 7 years in total, 2 of which we spent dating before tying the knot. I was 30, he was 32, and I had never been more sure of anything in my life when I said yes to his proposal. Back then, he was chasing an acting career with relentless passion, even if that meant working long hours for little to no pay. As a surgeon, I had a steady income and was more than capable of supporting us both. Covering the rent, groceries, utilities, all of it was something I gladly did, believing we were a team and that his success would come with time. I admired his drive, his refusal to give up even when he was barely scraping by with minor roles, usually as a background character in scenes no one remembered. But I believed in him, and I believed in us. Things finally started looking up for him a few months ago. He landed a minor speaking role in a full-length feature film. It wasn't leading man status, but 10 to 15 minutes on screen was more than he'd ever had before, and we both celebrated like he'd just won an Oscar. I bought champagne, made his favorite dinner, and toasted to a future that felt closer than ever. They were supposed to begin shooting soon, and I could see a spark in his eyes that had been missing. I was so proud, I felt like all our sacrifices were finally paying off. Then, just 5 days ago, that hope turned to ash. He served me with divorce papers. No long conversation, no heart-to-heart, just a knock on the door and a manila envelope that changed everything. I stood there in complete shock as he told me, with unsettling calmness, that he didn't feel the same way about me anymore. He wanted to focus entirely on his career now that real opportunities were coming his way. He claimed he needed to start fresh, unburdened by the remnants of a life that, apparently, included me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After all the years I spent holding us together, putting his dreams before mine, and loving him without conditions, he tossed it all aside like it meant nothing? I cried until I couldn't cry anymore. I remember pleading with him on my knees at one point, asking if we could work through it. He looked down at me and said there was nothing to fix. That was it. He packed up his belongings and walked out, leaving behind a hollow version of the life we had built. For the next 4 days, I was a ghost in my own home. I didn't go to work, I barely ate, and I certainly didn't sleep. Every room reminded me of him, our laughter, our plans, the moments I thought were real. I kept hoping I'd wake up from this nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. Then, yesterday, he called, not to check on me or talk about us, but to ask a favor. He needed some of his formal clothes dropped off at a friend's house where he was currently staying. He had an important meeting and needed his suits. I agreed, maybe out of habit, maybe because some part of me still hoped I could talk him into coming back. My heart clung to the smallest shred of hope, however irrational. When I arrived at his friend's apartment, the door was slightly ajar. I could hear voices inside. My husband and his friend were talking. I was about to knock when I paused. Something in their tone made me freeze. I heard his friend ask him directly, "Why did you even marry her if you never planned on staying?" The world stopped spinning for a moment. My breath caught in my throat as I silently stepped back and pressed myself against the wall, listening. My gut told me I needed to hear this. What came next shattered whatever was left of my heart. He laughed. That's how he began his response, a laugh. Then, with no trace of guilt, he said that he only married me to use me as a stepping stone in his career. According to him, there was never any real love involved. He said he had used our marriage as a way to survive until he found a better opportunity. And worse, he bragged about cheating on me countless times with women he met on sets and at parties. Apparently, he never saw me as anything more than a temporary support system, a convenience. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm in and confront him. But I didn't. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my ears, my hands trembling. And it wasn't over. He continued, explaining to his friend how he met me through a mutual acquaintance who had told him about my father, a highly respected dental surgeon with a glowing reputation in our state. That much was true. My father was incredibly accomplished, and he also had an elite clientele, including one particular famous actor who was known to be a regular patient of his. Apparently, my husband had heard this through the grapevine and saw me as a golden ticket into the entertainment industry. As he talked, everything began to make sense. Every compliment he gave me, every sweet gesture, it was all part of a performance, a long con. He said that asking me out had been his last-ditch effort to make it big, and the fact that I was wealthy and easy to manipulate made the whole deal even sweeter. He faked love for 5 years. He lived in our home, shared my bed, and looked me in the eye every day, all while plotting how to get close to my father's famous client. The opportunity finally came at my dad's 50th wedding anniversary party, just 5 months ago. My father had invited many of his old friends and professional acquaintances to celebrate. The famous actor was among them, and my husband practically glued himself to the man's side the entire evening. As I stood outside the door, reliving the last 5 years through this new lens, the weight of betrayal crushed me. I couldn't have imagined the extent of his deception, not even in my worst nightmares. Somehow, during my father's anniversary celebration, my husband had managed to charm his way into a conversation with that high-profile actor, my dad's longtime client. The man was only there for about 30 minutes, barely enough time to mingle, but my husband saw that narrow window as his golden opportunity. I didn't witness the conversation myself. I was too busy hosting guests and making sure everything went smoothly. But hearing my husband's smug recounting of the moment, I could envision it perfectly. He had probably flashed his most disarming smile, thrown in a few well-timed compliments, and subtly hinted at his aspirations. My husband, despite everything, had a magnetic charisma when he chose to use it. That ability to make people like him instantly. It was part of what drew me to him all those years ago. But now, realizing he had used that very charm to manipulate not just me but my father's network, made my stomach churn. The fact that he leveraged that brief exchange into a professional relationship, going so far as to get the actor's personal number, only added to the sting. He had spent 5 years of his life, and mine, waiting for that one chance. 5 years of building a false marriage, lying to my face every single day, just so he could worm his way into the industry through my family. And as if that wasn't enough, the movie role he was so proud of, the one he thought would change everything, that came directly from the actor's recommendation to the director. That role, his big break, was mine to give, even if I never realized it. And yet I was the one left heartbroken. I was the one who had been betrayed and abandoned, left to pick up the pieces of a life built on lies. I was supposed to quietly accept this divorce, pretend the last 5 years never happened, while he walked away with a career boost he earned by deceiving the person who cared most about him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to slam the door open and confront him right there. But I didn't. I turned around, walked back to my car with as much dignity as I could muster, and drove home. That afternoon was a whirlwind of emotions. Rage-racing disbelief. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as my mind ran through every moment we'd shared. I had trusted him with everything, and he had repaid me by treating me like a stepping stone. Once I was back in the safety of my own space, I tried to calm myself down. I lit candles, played soft music, even attempted to meditate, but my thoughts kept circling back to him, to that smug voice bragging about how easily he had played me. I knew I had to do something. The idea of him benefiting from this betrayal was unbearable. At first I fantasized about confronting him publicly, calling out his lies in front of his new friends, or crashing his next industry party, but that would only give him more attention, something he craved. Then a more strategic idea took root. What if I talked to the actor directly? My dad's client, the same man who helped my husband get that role. He had known me since I was a teenager. We weren't especially close, but he had seen me grow up. Surely he'd care if he knew his influence had been used to benefit someone so unethical. At the very least, I figured, it was worth trying. So I approached my dad casually and asked for the actor's contact number, pretending it was for something routine. Thankfully, my father didn't press for details. I hadn't told him or anyone in my family about the divorce yet. Some part of me still hoped it might all be reversed, or at least that I could handle it without dragging others into the mess. But by that point, I knew the truth had to come out. With the number in hand, I sat for a long time before dialing. My palms were sweaty, and my heart was racing. What would I even say? Would he believe me? Would he think I was being dramatic or bitter? I almost talked myself out of it, but then I remembered my husband's laugh as he recounted how easily he had manipulated me, and the anger reignited. After a few attempts, I finally got through to the actor's assistant. I introduced myself, explained who I was, and requested to speak with him. It took a couple of callbacks, but eventually the assistant transferred my call. There he was, his voice warm, polite, slightly surprised to hear from me. I skipped over pleasantries and launched into the truth, every word poured out like a dam breaking. I told him how my husband had used me, how the entire marriage had been a lie crafted to access him. I explained the manipulation, the infidelity, and how his recommendation had unknowingly enabled someone so deceitful. My voice cracked as I spoke, but I didn't hold back. I asked him, pleaded even, to reconsider allowing my husband to stay attached to the project. He had no contract yet, just a verbal commitment, which meant there was still time to act. There was a moment of silence on the line, a heavy pause, and then he simply said, "I'll look into it." I thanked him, heart pounding, and hung up. The next few hours crawled by. I kept checking my phone, half expecting my husband to show up at my door again. Sure enough, around 10 p.m., the calls started, one after another, dozens of missed calls, voicemails, and frantic messages. That's when I knew the actor had followed through. My husband had been dropped from the film. Relief washed over me like a wave. I texted a simple thank you to the actor, letting him know how much it meant. He responded almost immediately with kind words and even wished me strength and happiness for the future. That small act of kindness, of being believed and supported, restored something in me. I turned my phone off after that and curled up in bed, genuinely at peace for the first time in days. I think I slept better that night than I had in years. But peace doesn't always last long. This morning, just as I was getting ready for work, I heard him outside, shouting my name, banging on the door like a madman. I froze, debating whether to ignore him. But he wouldn't stop. Eventually, I cracked the door open and told him I was leaving for work and had no time to talk. He begged for one last conversation. I sighed, annoyed, and let him in for a few minutes. He dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face, claiming he had made a terrible mistake, that I was the only woman he had ever truly loved. But now, I saw right through him. I wasn't moved. I had lived with this actor long enough to recognize when a performance was happening, and this was one of his finest. I let him cry, let him plead, and then I smiled sweetly and asked him, "So, how's that movie role working out for you?" The sarcasm in my voice was sharp and deliberate. I didn't need his apology. I had already reclaimed my power. He looked stunned. Just for a moment, his bravado melted away and was replaced by a brief flicker of realization. His mouth twitched, and he stumbled back a step, trying to process what had just dawned on him. It was written all over his face. The woman he had deceived, manipulated, and discarded had pulled the rug out from under him. He knew. He finally understood that I had been the one behind the sudden and devastating collapse of his big break. The moment the pieces clicked in his head, the calm shattered. He exploded in fury, his voice rising with every second, accusing me of destroying his life, screaming that I had ruined everything he had worked for. His face contorted with rage, spit flying from his mouth as he launched into a full-blown tirade right there in my living room. But I didn't let it slide. I gave it right back to him, my voice firm, unwavering. I reminded him that he had destroyed 5 years of my life with his lies and manipulation. If he was looking for someone to blame, he only had to look in a mirror. We screamed at each other for what must have been 5 minutes, though it felt much longer. Eventually, his anger gave way to something else: defeat. His shoulders slumped and his knees buckled slightly as he realized the shouting wasn't going to change anything. The role was gone. His comfortable life with me was over, and he had no one to blame but himself. I could see that truth sinking in. For a split second, I felt a flicker of pity. Seeing someone break down like that, even someone who had hurt me so deeply, tugged at a part of me that still remembered who I thought he was. But then, through his tears, he spat out one last threat. He swore he'd take everything from me in the divorce, that he'd leave me penniless and on the streets. Whatever residual sympathy I had for him vanished in that moment. It was replaced with cold, clear anger. I told him, with a calmness that probably surprised us both, to get the hell out of my house. No more arguments, no more conversations, just leave. He obeyed, but not without a final dramatic display. Still crying, still muttering insults under his breath as he walked out. After that emotional hurricane, I decided to take the day off work again. I couldn't focus, couldn't pretend to be okay. My mind was a mess, trying to process everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the sense of justice I felt from retaliating, all mixed into one overwhelming storm inside me. Later that day, I finally told my close friends and family about the divorce. Up until then, I hadn't said a word. I'd been holding it in, still hoping things might reverse or at least end quietly. But now that everything was out in the open, I needed the support. Their reactions mirrored my own disbelief. None of them had seen it coming. My father especially was furious. He wanted to confront my ex-husband physically, to teach him a lesson the old-fashioned way. It took a lot of convincing to calm him down. My friends were equally appalled. Once I explained what I'd overheard at that apartment and how calculated everything had been, they agreed that my actions were justified. In fact, many of them said I had shown remarkable restraint. If anything, I could have done worse. But I didn't. I had acted with intention and, for the most part, civility. Still, the fallout wasn't over. My ex didn't take the loss quietly. He started harassing me online, demanding I take back my words, begging for help to get his role reinstated. I blocked him on every platform, but he was persistent, making new accounts, messaging me from different usernames. It got to the point where I considered quitting social media altogether, just to escape his relentless attempts to invade my peace. His sense of entitlement baffled me. After everything he'd done, using me, cheating on me, lying to my face, he still thought he had the right to demand anything from me? To try to guilt me into fixing the mess he had created? And his threats about the divorce? Empty words. We both knew he didn't have the means or the legal standing to touch anything I owned. He wasn't entitled to a dime, and the idea that he could somehow leave me destitute was laughable. Still, his constant digital harassment chipped away at my nerves. Then things escalated. A few days after I had blocked him online, I started receiving a flood of spam calls, dozens, then hundreds. Unknown numbers from all over. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Every few minutes, another call. It was clear he had found some way to spoof or generate these numbers to torment me. It was harassment, plain and simple. Frustrated and exhausted, I finally called him. I tried to reason with him, warned that these stunts could affect the outcome of the divorce settlement. It was a bluff, of course. There wasn't going to be any significant settlement in his favor, but I hoped the threat would be enough to make him stop. He denied everything, claimed he had no idea what I was talking about. But I knew his voice well enough to hear the lie in every word. When he suggested, in a thinly veiled threat, that maybe, just maybe, the calls would stop if I helped him get his role back, I lost it. I screamed into the phone, cursed him out with every ounce of fury I'd been holding back, and hung up. I haven't turned my phone back on since. I've been using my laptop for everything, email, messages, even calls through encrypted apps. I plan to change my number soon, hopefully before he finds another way to get to me. As for the divorce, I'm not contesting it. Why would I? I want nothing to do with him, legally or otherwise. Let the papers finalize, let the chapter close. The sooner the better. Our court appearance was scheduled in just a few days. Despite this looming legal confrontation, my husband continued behaving like a man with nothing to lose. Aggressive, erratic, and entirely unreasonable. I couldn't understand why he was still harassing me when he knew full well that we would soon be standing before a judge. One would think he'd at least pretend to be civil for the sake of appearances, or to avoid additional legal trouble. But that wasn't him. That wasn't the man I had married, or rather, the man I thought I had married. It was clear by now that I had never really known him at all. He was lucky I didn't want to retaliate further. I had already done what I felt was necessary to reclaim my dignity and protect myself. At this point, all I wanted was peace. I had no interest in revenge anymore. The fire in me had burned bright, but now it was fading into tired embers. I didn't want to spend one more minute of my life entangled in the bitterness he had left behind. Letting go of the anger, the resentment, even the sadness, was my only way forward. I didn't care if he rebuilt his life or let it fall apart completely. I didn't care about his future, and I certainly didn't want any part of it. Then came the next horror. Just 2 days before our court date, he pulled the most unhinged stunt of all. By that time, I had changed my phone number. My social media accounts were deactivated. I was confident he couldn't find me, couldn't reach me anymore. For once, I felt like I had some control over my own life again. But I had severely underestimated just how far gone he was. It happened in the evening. I was walking to my car after a long day at work, feeling tired but relieved that I'd soon be home. Just as I reached for the door handle, he appeared. Out of nowhere, he slid into the passenger seat of my car and slammed the door shut. My heart stopped. I barely had time to react before he locked the doors from the inside. My instincts kicked in. I reached for my purse to grab my pepper spray, but he was faster. He snatched it from my hands and threw it into the back seat. Panic surged through me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what he was capable of anymore, and I was terrified of what would happen next. But instead of yelling or threatening me, he spoke in a disturbingly calm voice. That tone scared me even more than if he had shouted. He said he didn't want to hurt me. He just wanted one thing: for me to call my father's famous client and retract everything I had told him. He wanted me to fix things, to somehow convince the actor to give him the role back. I didn't respond right away. My brain was working overtime, searching for a way out. I told him that I'd need my phone to make the call. He hesitated, but eventually reached into the back seat and handed me my purse. That was his biggest mistake. The moment my fingers closed around it, I yanked out the pepper spray and unloaded half the canister directly into his face. The sting hit me too. My eyes watered, my skin burned, but he got the worst of it. He screamed, clutching his face, trying to breathe. I didn't wait. I unlocked the door, shoved him out, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't get far. My vision was too blurred to safely navigate traffic. I pulled over just a few yards from my office, heart racing, eyes still burning. That's when a cab rolled up. The driver, sensing something was terribly wrong, offered to help. Without hesitation, I asked him to take me to the nearest police station. The next 2 hours passed in a fog. I was scared, disoriented, overwhelmed. I filed a report and pressed charges. Thankfully, my husband hadn't been able to flee. His condition after the pepper spray incident left him slumped on the pavement, wheezing and red-faced. When the officers arrived, he was still there, 2 days to run. He was arrested on the spot. After leaving the station, I didn't go home. I went straight to my parents' house. I needed to feel safe, and I couldn't trust that he wouldn't show up again. My parents took me in without question. My mom made me tea and wrapped me in a blanket like she used to when I was a little girl. My dad, on the other hand, was furious. He vowed that he'd do everything in his power to ensure that my ex faced real consequences for what he had done. For the next few days, I didn't leave the house. I couldn't. The trauma of that encounter lingered. I jumped at every sound. I flinched at shadows. But slowly, with time and support, I started to feel grounded again. And then came the final update, the one I'd been hoping for. A few weeks later, the case moved quickly. Given the circumstances, the judge didn't hesitate. My husband was sentenced to 3 months in jail along with a hefty fine. Was it enough? Not nearly. I wish he'd gotten more time, but it was still justice, and that was something I could live with. As for the divorce, it was fast-tracked. What usually takes months or even years was resolved in a matter of weeks. He walked away with nothing, no compensation, no shared assets, no rights to anything I owned. I even sold our house and my car. Anything he could use to find or manipulate me again was eliminated. I started fresh. I got a new job at a different hospital, one that's much closer to my parents' home. The work environment is healthier, the commute is easier, and most importantly, I feel like I've stepped into a new chapter of life, one where I'm not constantly looking over my shoulder. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful. And I'm free. I'm still staying at my parents' home for now, mostly because they won't even consider letting me return to living alone, not after everything that's happened. Even though I know my husband can't reach me anymore, at least not in any practical or immediate way, they remain adamant, and honestly, I think I'm grateful for that. Their insistence on keeping me close has become a comfort I didn't know I needed. I might not have fully grasped how deeply the trauma had affected me until I felt the relief of simply being around people who truly care. The emotional aftermath still lingers. I've started going to therapy, trying to navigate this storm inside me, unangling confusion, grief, and betrayal one layer at a time. Healing doesn't come overnight, and I've stopped expecting that it ever could. Even though I'm trying so hard to focus on myself, to reclaim peace and stability, the memories creep in. Some days they arrive like whispers, other times they crash down like waves. It's almost impossible not to think about the years we spent together. Not all of it felt false. That's what makes it hurt. The parts that seemed real, the words that sounded honest, the smiles that looked genuine. Were they all lies? Or was I just too blind to see the truth? I ask myself that more often than I'd like to admit. But when I catch myself slipping, I force my mind back to that parking lot, to the reality of who he became and the danger I narrowly escaped. That reminder keeps me anchored. I'm still healing, still hurting, but I'm standing. One breath, one moment, one day at a time, and I promise myself that better days are coming. I need them to.